be as a school, at that time. And not a whole lot actually happened in terms of discussion, but I do remember in one class, which was actually about critical theory and was not about Islam, some young man who was Swedish and typically sort of liberal and all of that said, my problem with this cartoon issue is that Muslims are trying to impose Sharia on on the West by asking us not to show these blasphemous cartoons. And I felt, and there were even Muslim students in the class, and I just felt like, was I the only person that wanted to clean out his ears and ask, well, what did this guy just say? And it came out of this similar, first a basic fear of Muslims. They are here to impose, like the Ottoman Empire is still on the march, to Europe. They're here to impose something on us, and that civil responsibility or respect could be equated to imposing the Sharia on a place like Scandinavia. It doesn't have that many Muslims comparatively.
Almost the same, I think. I mean, in my opinion, it's kind of cultural mindset that this kind of Islamophobia, in the grassroots we see, but in academic way, then they try to expand it in more kind of, more academic, but still, it's almost the same. The cultural mindset is still. That's probably as the Jews. Also, you said to me that how the Bernard Lewis, that they have no kind of minority surviving, that they want always to be a ruler. This is always kind of, for me, a fear, so that the Islamophobia always happen again.
I mean, if
as you mentioned, some kind of multicultural ideas in the book,
he waves it away as it is. Yes, they disagree and so on, but and here's the significant one of the important points is, to what extent are we talking about a different political agenda? Because all the examples seem to be is that these Muslims, they have different cultural manifestations, but they seem to not agree with certain policies, such as the invasion of Iraq, right? Or the slaughter of Palestinians. They find that objectionable. Now, but and here, yes, I think you can say that various Muslim organizations, various Muslim cultures do seem to coalesce over certain similar policy views, but to the extent that they're uniquely Islamic as opposed to perhaps third world or non-white, or if you will, even cosmopolitan, because you quite often find groups, a Mexican group will have the same, will agree on the same policy objectives that have the same worldview of world power and the dominance of certain world powers and so on. So I'm not sure that it's uniquely Islamic as opposed to the shared experience of people from cultures and races that have not controlled the world for the past few hundred years and demand a bigger share of the pie. But it's very interesting, if you notice, he makes Israel as if it's a test point, and that makes me a question, well, to what extent are these are fitted intellectual categories to fundamentally political disputes that really have nothing to do with history. But basically, he doesn't like the policy choices of Muslim populations in the West, realizes that as they gain more ground, they'll be able to exert more pressure on their local governments, and they might actually shift the policies of their local governments. They might make these policies less pro-American, less pro-Israel, I don't know, more pro-India, more pro-Indonesia, whatever. And that, to him, is troubling. Because I think there's a lot we can say about the concept of an ummah, but the problematic with either this type of narrative or that type of narrative is that it derails any beneficial, substantive discourse that is grounded in anything. I mean, there are many ways they're highly politicized constructs being superimposed upon law, theology, history. And again, going back to the role of the public intellectual, well, how do we expose the political for what it is? How do we come in and say, listen, Mr. Christopher Caldwell, he's not a professor, he's a journalist, I believe. I mean, the guy, look, he looks very happy with himself. He looks very content.
Journalists usually are more than professors.
Yeah, he thinks he's very smart, honestly. What you're really talking about is politics, and I wish you would be honest enough to just say, these immigrant communities have different political choices, and I hate it, and I want to convince them that their political choices are wrong, instead of this hack job of using historical symbols and images and legal concepts or theological concepts and sort of pasting them together to construct what is fundamentally a politically motivated argument. I mean, do you think, is that an accurate way of reading it?
I think also that it's, and what always surprises me is with the piecing together and all of that, it's of these elements of like Islamic tradition, like in this example, or you've mentioned a couple times the concept of ijtihad, where you'll have people coming up saying, yes, but these people stopped thinking at a certain era because they've read some little bit here and there, of some history or theology, what have you, and come to some very big conclusions based on it without a lot of knowledge. And that to me is always the scariest, because it sounds very dressed up. And once you say a word like ijtihad on CNN, especially in America,
it's name dropping.
Yeah.
I mean, it is name dropping. It's like if you show up and you say the word ummah, then you must know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
You know the word ummah, so oh God, that must be very impressive. Let's get. Point is this process of derailment. Now let's penetrate a bit deeper into this. Let us talk about the idea of ummah, because one effect of this discourse, and one that I worry about tremendously, is that you find serious scholars, particularly students and young scholars, steer away from the concept because of its politicized nature. So I don't know when is the last serious scholarly work done on the theology of ummah in Islamic thought. I don't know what is all the examples I can think of are not are either during the colonial age or pre-colonial, but post-colonial, practically nothing. Now, but part of this is he's not the only one essentializing the idea of an ummah, by the way. The other part are the Hizb al-Tahriri fellows, right? Who tell us, well, there's this ummah, and the ummah has a duty to be one. Cultural differences, national differences, any type of richness of any type is it's a form of a heresy, something to be treated rather than something to be celebrated. And at the same time, providing the ammunition for people like that to take their simplification of the concept of an ummah and use it for their own goals. So we remain caught between two polarized processes, right? He looks like
Very smart.
very smart. Two polarized processes between the highly politicized Muslim processes of utilizing this symbolic construct of an ummah, and then the non-Muslim politicized symbolic use of the symbolic construct of an ummah. Now, is there something more in a concept such as ummah? Could we imagine something other than these two polarized symbolic constructs? Well, and how far do we need to go in order to find something more? Well, if you try to do what is very difficult, and that is to forget your political environment, forget the Hizb al-Tahriris, and forget the Islamophobes and so on, and say, well, I want to look at this idea from a non-politicized perspective and sort of see where the evidence takes me. One of the things that would immediately catch your attention is the ummah, the idea of an ummah as a theology. It is sustained as an ideal. There is no, you cannot study religion without your religious teachers telling you that Muslims belong to an ummah and that they should feel for each other and there should be a sense of cooperation and so on. But and in fact this ideal is, to what extent is it used to bolster the idea of a single khilafah? That's historically debatable. What's remarkable is the discourse on the khilafah is not the same as the discourse on the ummah. Take for instance the Ahlul Bayt and the rebellions of Ahlul Bayt. In their own theological treatises, they never conceded that the Khilafah represented the Ummah in any shape, form, or way. The texts, the surviving texts that we have of the various Khawarij sects, mostly Ibadi, of course, today, or the texts of the Ibadis, again, never a concession that the Khilafah in any way represented the Ummah. The Umayyads, their claim of being a representation of the Ummah was contested from the get-go, right? And even the short period in which the Abbasids come to power, their claim is And then we get now to some seriously interesting refinements. So, for instance, we find, I'll throw in a few sort of like tantalizing clues and then let's investigate it. We find someone like Abu Bakr al-Razi. Abu Bakr al-Razi tells us, well, the Ummah is the Ummah is not a geographic territory, it is a spiritual category. Ibn Taymiyyah takes this a step further and tells you, now this is quite fascinating. Ibn Taymiyyah tells you that one person, if they are on the right path, could represent the whole Ummah, while all other human beings, if they're on the wrong path, do not represent the Ummah. So, I mean, here, Ummah becomes a moral category that is contested. Ibn Taymiyyah, remember, he lived during the Mongol rule, and he looks around and he says, I don't see Ummah in the people who are governing, the governors who sentenced him to prison, they don't see an Ummah. But he even refuses to say that I see an Ummah in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He says, I see Ummah in the ethical conduct of individual Muslims. All right. Now, we go even further into Islamic theology, and we have some tantalizing figures, like, of course, Ibn Arabi, who will forever be studied. But Ibn Arabi, I consider, is always a difficult example because, you know, what he says is always extremely layered and so on. But even if we take someone like Ibn Aqil, both Ibn Arabi and Ibn Aqil tell you something that is quite fascinating. He says that you do not need to be. He raises the questions with justice, and he said both of them, and they say, is God support an unjust Muslim, or would God support a just non-Muslim? Right? So a Muslim who's unjust and a non-Muslim who is just. God would do what? Support which? And both Ibn Aqil and Ibn Arabi say God would support the just non-Muslim. Okay? This is, of course, for someone like Imam Ibn Muflih, is one of the reasons he hates Ibn Arabi, is because he says, how could he say that? You know, God would always give support to the Muslim. But you know, now, but this is the beginning of the discussion, and then Ibn Aqil and Ibn Arabi go on to say that the Ummah are the people of divinity, whether they're Muslim or not. Now, here the Ummah becomes a what? It's a universal category. It's nearly the category of, as in fact, George Maqdisi is the only modern scholar that I can think of who noticed this. In his book, The Rise of Humanism in Islam, in one of the footnotes, he says that it's as if the Ummah becomes a notion of the human. So it's a very close idea to the humanism, in that the attributes of divinity So, Ibn Arabi, in his typical, if you've read Ibn Arabi, you know his typical elusive way. You know what I'm talking about. He says that I walk and I see beauty manifest. I ask not who owns this land. I know that I am in the Ummah. So it's beauty manifesting. Now Ibn Aqil was more a rationalist than a spiritualist. It says I am Ibn Aqil had a usually Socratic method of discussion, and his Kitab al-Funun, which is 100 volumes, by the way, to this date, mostly not published. The only thing published out of Kitab al-Funun is 1 volume. It's ridiculous. Well, it's one of the most remarkable texts you can read in the Islamic civilization. I mean, and its impact was amazing. Anyway, Ibn Aqil says that I am asked to accept. The Quran teaches me that the Ummah is God's Ummah. They're God's people. And it says they are asking me to accept that what is God's could be qabih, could be ugly or unjust. And that, to me, is irrational impossibility. So, in his argument that it is, if a people are plagued by ugliness or injustice, then by definition they cannot be an ummah. Now, so here, the least one can say is you have a fascinating construct that shifts very much, by the way, like Sharia. Just incidentally, that shifts between the territorial, the geographic, the jurisdictional, to the spiritual, to the ethical, to the humanistic, to even the aesthetic. And yet, I think you can imagine, I think you can imagine my sense of loss as a Muslim scholar, that, alhamdulillah, I got immersed in Islamic texts first before I discovered the ugliness of politics. So it's, and so here you are, you're reading these texts on the various debates of various, and by the way, there are manuscripts that were written dedicated to the al-madhahib fil ummah. I mean, just outright the various schools of thought on what the ummah is. None of these texts, to my knowledge, have been published. I found these manuscripts in Dar al-Kutub in Egypt. I found one, and I found in Maktabat al-Azhar another one, and I was in Istanbul, and I found a third. But to my knowledge, and the people that Hussein Mudarrisi is usually a very good source. He's at Princeton about what sources are published and not. He said that none are published. So anyway, there are even texts that have collected the various perspectives and tried to compile them. But then you, in encountering this tradition, you find this very polarized debate. If you come out narrating what the tradition or the ummah discourses, let's say, you can imagine you stand accused by both sides, right? On the one hand, Hizb ut-Tahrir will say, you're diluting the notion of an ummah. what nonsense is this? You know, the Ummah has always been the Khilafah, right? On the other side, say, oh, this is your Western influence. This is your Western education speaking. This is not true Islam. The Ummah as humanity. This notion could have only been learned by the West. I mean, it's quite, of course, hysterically ridiculous. Even when you bring the text of Ibn Aqil and say, here, you know, read it, you still say, well, but you know, it doesn't really mean what you're saying. The frustrations I share with you as a scholar, I also share with you as future, both as in your capacity as students, as scholars in the making, as the intellectual milieus are not just born, they're created, they're manufactured. And they're manufactured by conscientious and conscious acts of both truth and deception. But invariably, negotiation. One hopes that in this negotiative act, that the ingredients of truth, the ingredients of seriousness, the ingredients of serious thought would be higher than the ingredients of simple stereotypes and deceptiveness. But that entirely depends on us, doesn't it? And on your awareness as an intellectual, your submissiveness or your lack of submissiveness as an intellectual. And something that we'll talk about more, something I've been raised on, is your humility as an ethical human being. To always say, well, if I look at human affairs, just the way people have lived Islam, the narrative, that simplistic narrative of that smug guy, or the simplistic narrative of Hazm al-Tahrir, it doesn't seem to match with the historical complexity, right? And could people truly live with their theory in one place and their life in a completely different place? Well, Orientalism has been telling us for centuries that this is exactly where Muslims are. That Muslims have ideals, but they have very different realities. I think one of the biggest acts of challenging Orientalism is to say that in itself is a stereotype that is a projection upon the other, or who is the other. Because I've not seen too many human societies in which people can live in a perpetual state of theory being one thing and their lived historical experience being another. They ultimately negotiate each other. So I think that's enough for today. I've given you a headache and given myself a headache. That stuff. Okay.
It's a good headache.
So, tomorrow, inshallah, we should get to the. I want to the core notion of submission.
I'm glad we started off with something, low key. We definitely went right in from the beginning of the class.
I always tell my graduate students that if you want to, that you put as much time in your teaching as you do in your writing. Because it's a production, and you can vomit the information out, but you don't capture the attention of students, and then just go and slice through. But it's very so. I usually don't welcome this getting this Islam hating stuff on my computer. But when I saw it last night, I said, God, you came at the right time. I was looking for the right entry to this class. So one of the very few times I think I've been grateful to the Islamophobes. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Do you know Professor Sabra?
Adam Sabra, yeah. He was my colleague in Princeton.
Yeah, he was my supervisor.
Oh, really?
He supervised my thesis. And was in Michigan before he moved to Georgia.
Oh, really? Yeah. Are you saying?
Yeah, I took his class on I forget the name.
And what did your thesis on?
My thesis, actually, Biruni Shahrastanians.
Ah. He was, I think,
on Hinduism. I supervised by Kevin from particular region. Kevin also.
And are you almost finished?
near the
end?
Yeah, that's what
He's always an intense guy.
Okay.
After
the
tell you
year
what's
is over, they give you one semester to work on your thesis.
Our class
But you have to do this fast. They give us a summer.
Yes.
You finish your classes and exams in June, and it's
always
after
sit
that.
in the
I mean, I have
hallway
friends also.
of the department, and we have this huge book of Hegel. And Hegel is very different. It's one of those different philosophers. And you see this guy had hours in the hallway, not in the library, almost every. Reading. Some Hegel. And no one has ever figured out why.
Started from,
Why always. So we have why was he so fascinated with Hegel? Why was he was reading that book? The book was a couple thousand pages.
Yeah,
He was reading it. No. In the holes in the hallway, the same spot. So he's a really nice. He's a very nice guy.
Actually, my dissertation, my topic, I changed my topic after reading his book, Poverty and Charity.
Yeah.
And I made more research in my country. It's more research in my country. Some research for institution and charity.
Just that.
Proposal and
I actually forgot that that was all.
So it's the same. He doesn't have to find
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.